Hello. It's working. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the October open meeting of Perth U3A. An excellent turnout, despite it being a very fine morning out. So it's very welcome to everybody, and perhaps a particular welcome to a number of non-members who are coming along. These meetings are open to everybody, not just members of Perth U3A. We've got a very excellent talk lined up about Branklyn Garden, but before that I'm going to ask Yvonne to read out the content of the news roundup for this month. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Good to see such a wonderful turnout this morning. So I've got a few things to tell you. The first is a bit of... Is that better? Right. Thanks, Jill. So I said good morning in case you missed that. And it's great to see so many of you here. My first item is a bit of good news, which is we have an additional committee member. His name's John Sievers, and I don't know whether, John, are you here today? Oh, right. Just want to stand up. There he is, our new committee member in the flesh. Okay. So he doesn't have a specific role on the committee, but I'm sure he's going to be jolly useful anyway. So, Unit 4, again. A few people have told us that there's a problem with the heating in Unit 7, and frankly, I've experienced this too. We're talking to building management, but in the meantime, when you leave Unit 7, if you're somebody that uses it, could you please leave the heating on setting number 3 so that we can capture whatever little heat is actually coming off the radiators to keep the room vaguely warm. That would be great. And if you do have any problems, it would be great if you could speak or let Wilma Coleman, our accommodation coordinator, know. And when I send this around by email, you'll see her, how to get in contact with her. Because the more reports she gets, the strength she gets from you, the stronger her case when she's talking to building management. Also, a reminder to all of us who use Unit 7 that we have a collective responsibility to keep it clean. We don't have any paid cleaners who go in there at all to clean it. It's our job to do that. So if you have a spill or somebody drops something on the ground or on the floor or whatever, please clean it up, and do remember to wash up your cups and your teaspoons and so on, and just keep that coffee area nice and neat, or relatively neat, and free of spills. That would be great. Thank you very much. Next up is Christmas lunch. It's not too late to sign up for our Christmas lunch. It's at the Royal George this year on the 11th of December. And you'll get, when I send this out, you'll get a means to contact John, who's taking your list of names as to who wants to come along. If you've already signed up, you can pay today or at any upcoming open meetings. Irene's here somewhere and can take your payment by card, or you'll be able to pay by cheque. And John can let you know by email how to pay by cheque. And finally, Friends of Perth and Kinross Archive have been in contact with me, and Richard, as it happens. They're looking for volunteers to help with a project concerning the updating of late Rhoda Fothergill books on local subjects. Apparently, we made a book some years ago on the Fair Maid's House, and Rhoda Fothergill helped with that. So anyway, pardon? No, she didn't. Well, there you go. The archive people told me she did. So that's a bit worrying, isn't it? Anyway, if you're interested in helping them with this project, there'll be contact details on this when it comes around by email. And I'll be sending around an attachment that they sent me that you can have a look through as well. And here endeth my news.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Right, now it's my great pleasure to introduce Jim Jermyn, who is head gardener at Branklyn Garden and also former proprietor of Edrom Nurseries in Berwickshire. Jim is an internationally recognized horticulturalist and alpine plant specialist with 5 decades experience who has lectured all over the world. So we're very fortunate to have him today. He's also a published author and a horticultural consultant. Going to speak to us about Branklyn Garden and maybe a little bit more beside. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. It's a huge privilege to be back in Perth. I have to say that the 6 years that we spent at the helm at Branklyn was perhaps one of the most joyous times for Alison and myself and our wee naughty Jack Russell. Yes, I'm now retired and keeping out of mischief by working in the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh as a volunteer and doing some consultancy work at Old Denaira up near Comrie. But I love coming back to Branklyn and visiting the garden from time to time. But really, I don't want you to think that I'm anybody today. This is really a talk about John and Dorothy Renton, who created the garden 100 and a few years ago. And really, it's all about their legacy. So when Alison and I and our team, we had 50 volunteers at Branklyn, we were working, we would often think about how the garden came about. And you know, when you think back to the early 1920s, and you think of the type of work that was involved in creating just a small garden, just 2 acres, as you know, those of you who are familiar with the garden, that is extraordinary that on that steep slope they were able to carve out a garden that would become one of the most internationally acclaimed small gardens in Europe. And the thing is, that they did a lot of this work themselves. They actually did manage to get some prisoners to come across the river to help them in the early days. That couldn't happen today. I did ask the NTS, should we have a relationship with Scottish Prison Services and bring a few prisoners over to do the heavy work? They said no. So that was that. But so it is amazing to think of all the work. They built the arts and crafts house that Alice and I had the privilege of living in for 6 years. Amazing property. And then Alison created the tea room. And of course, unsurprisingly, we competed. Alice and I are very competitive. And I tried to make money by growing and buying in plants to sell. And she made scones and cakes. And of course, she beat me hands down. People seem to enjoy eating scones. And because they were freshly made, it's highly profitable. Whereas if you buy everything in, it's not. So yeah, I would welcome people at the gate, and I see Joyce, one of our wonderful volunteers from the shop, would welcome people, and I'd say, so good to see you. Have you been here before? Yes, nice to see you, Jim. We're going to the tea room. Very, very disappointing, you know. But, you know, when we arrived at Branklyn at the turn of the year in 2017, Alice and I thought, blimey, this garden is just so beautiful in the winter, and no visitors arrive until April the 1st. So I thought, what can we do about this? And so anyway, I suffer from an illness called galanthophilia, which is really a very worrying illness because it means that you collect snowdrops. And some of these snowdrops can cost up to £150 for a small bulb. So anyway, I imported my collection of snowdrops to Branklyn, and we started a snowdrop festival, which of course takes place in mid-February. So that meant that we could at least invite visitors to enjoy the tremendous amount of colour in the winter. You know, you don't need me to tell you about all the crocuses and the winter aconites, the witch hazels in flower and so on. So it was wonderful. And then, you know, when I brought in these snowdrops and we had our first snowdrop weekend, people said, we've heard, Jim, that you have over 200 different snowdrops. Surely they can't all be different. A snowdrop's a snowdrop. So I would take them to certain snowdrops, and like the one that we're seeing here, Little Ben, and they are distinct. Frankly, if you're going to have 200 snowdrops, you want to make sure they're different. You wouldn't want them all to be the same, particularly at that price. So, yeah, and do you know, we actually had a winter when we arrived. It was great fun, and do you know, last year we didn't have any snow. I'm in East Lothian now. We didn't have snow, and it was great. And this is actually so good for the garden. There are a lot of Himalayan plants that the Rentons introduced, and they actually benefit from a winter. They benefit from snow cover. And if you don't have snow cover, they're completely out of sync. They start growing suddenly now. And you think, why are these rhododendrons flowering? Why are these primulas flowering? So climate change has affected Branklyn Garden without any doubt. But you begin to see some of the variation in the snowdrops, and some of them are yellow. You don't see that quite so much, more on the smaller screen that's yellow, and that was created just round the corner by Elizabeth Harrison. That just appeared in her garden at Kinnaird. And yeah, some of these snowdrops are quite beautiful. My daughter was very disappointed when I planted one called Trumps. And she said, "Dad, I can't believe that you would get involved with politics in the garden." I said, "Cheryl, this snowdrop was raised by a very keen gardener in Norfolk. And when he suddenly saw this one with the green marks outside the petals, he felt he had come up trumps." So it has nothing to do with any American politician. So people would come into the garden and say, "Jim, not sure about the name on that snowdrop." And so I had to explain the story. But yes, I mean, you can see that some of these snowdrops have green markings on the outside. Some have no markings at all. So that means they cost up to about £350 for a bulb. So it's all exciting stuff. One of the exciting things when I arrived at Branklyn was we had a marvelous gardener called Alistair, and Alistair and I, we got on extremely well, and we had this big, thick red book that Mrs. Renton had created with every single accession from the 1920s until their passing in the mid-60s. And this was so helpful to us as current gardeners. So you're able to look at the plants and you think, that Mr. and Mrs. Renton, they grew this Primula whitei that was introduced from seed from Ludlow and Sheriff in 1949. And then you could see when it died, because they also had a note to say when it was deceased. And so I went to a friend of mine up at Cluny Garden. Some of you will be familiar with Cluny, up by Aberfeldy. And I said to John Mattingly, "I need to buy some Primula whitei from you, because this was an important accession from the Rentons." So having these records is so important. So I'm not going to labor the history of Branklyn from the Rentons' point of view, but without it, it's irrelevant. So everything is based on the work that the Rentons did and having important records. So record keeping is hugely important. Then every evening, once the garden was open and we'd closed up the tea room and the shop, Alice and I would sort things out, and then Alice would say, "Do you fancy a gin and tonic?" I said, "Well, that's a splendid idea." So we'd have a gin and tonic and then walk around the garden, have a bite to eat, and then I would start work. And that was the great thing about living in the garden. And I should mention that during COVID, from March the 13th to July the 3rd, I was entirely on my own at Branklyn Garden. I had no hassle. I have to be jolly careful in case there are any National Trust for Scotland trustees here, but I had no hassle from the National Trust for Scotland for that period. Our computers were actually closed down. There was no sound of traffic on Dundee Road. There were no aeroplanes. The garden was full of bird song, butterflies, and so on. It was amazing. But I didn't take it for granted, because my team were all furloughed. I was allowed to work because I lived in the garden. And anyone who had to travel was not allowed to work. So a lot of my friends suffered a bit during lockdown, and I was quite the opposite. I was living the life, as it were. So I had to be careful not to say too much in a positive way, but to be able to walk around the garden and have all of all this work that the Rentons had carried out was a huge privilege. And it doesn't just happen. They were very smart because they created this woodland garden. Everything you see was planted by the Rentons, with the exception of an ancient pear tree, which still lives to today, which was planted in the 1800s, because it was all fruit. It was all top fruit, apples and pears going round towards the Cass, and quite interesting. But yes, the flowers were simply stunning, no question about it. And everything we tried to make sure was labeled, because some of our visitors, I would say 50% of our visitors, were very keen gardeners and were keen to know what the plants were exactly, so we had them all labeled, and others just enjoyed walking around the garden. But people who take photographs like to know what they're taking, and so they take a photograph. By the way, I do exactly the same, and then photograph the label. It's very, very useful. The views through the garden are stunning. And really, this is what Mrs. Renton was wanting. She would sit in her library, which is now the tea room, and she would enjoy the garden. We have to imagine that right up until the 60s, they would just have parties, gin and tonic parties probably, inviting their friends. So that was the extent of the enjoyment for the Rentons. They loved having visitors, but they were very concerned about having a superb view. So if you're sitting up in the tea room and you're looking towards Moncrief Hill, they created the garden with everything in mind for views. And that's very clever. I'm not that clever, no question. I've created quite a few gardens, but I'm creating them for my wife and my family. I'm not thinking about hundreds of years beyond. This was very unselfish of them to create a garden like this. And then of rhododendrons. I mean, you go to the west coast, to Arduni, Carre, and these rhododendrons, I mean, they're huge gardens, and they grow very much bigger. It's wetter, and there are midges. We don't have midges at Branklyn, and it doesn't rain enough, I hasten to add. 22 inches is seriously dry, whereas it's more than double that when you go to Argyll. And so, but the rhododendrons were cleverly planted. And I had the privilege of having the late Peter Cox, who would come round from Glendoick. He would come in, again, with his late wife, Patricia, and they would come round, and I'd known him for many years, and he said, Jim, you need to do something about this rhododendron. It's getting a bit tired. You need to prune it, give it a good feed. And then he would look a bit further on. He said, this is getting very, very tired. If I'd put it on the bonfire and start again, in other words, come to my nursery and buy another one. However, I remember Kenneth was taking his mum round in a wheelchair one time, and she said, Jim, come here. Now, I was quite frightened, actually, of Patricia. And she said, this rhododendron was delivered by Peter and myself to the Rentons when we were courting. She said, look after it well. And I thought, blimey, that's no pressure. But, you know, it was wonderful having people like that who would come into Branklyn and give us advice and tell me. It was wonderful to be told what to do. I'm no expert on rhododendrons. I'm a bit of an alpine chap. But it was great having them. And some of these rhododendrons were simply stunning. When you come into Branklyn in May, and you come round towards the tea room, there's a shrub of rhododendron Edgeworthii just tucked below the wall, and you wonder, what's this scent? It's just amazing. And it's rhododendron Edgeworthii. And further down, there's a Lindleyi that was introduced in 1949 by George Sheriff from Bhutan, and it has amazing fragrance as well. But I was advised when I arrived, you need to position these in a really protected position. So we actually did move them. But they're very splendid. Now, the rhododendron that's on the right-hand side, Rhododendron arizelum, the seed was collected by George Forrest from Yunnan in southwest China in the 1930s. And the Rentons raised it from seed. And remarkably, during lockdown, it flowered for the first time. So some of these rhododendrons take ages to flower. So I immediately phoned up Kenneth Cox around the corner at Glendoick, and I said, do you think you're within the allowed mileage that you can nip round and have a look at this rhododendron? Because I think you'll be excited to see it. And of course, he came round and he was very excited to see it. So with some of these plants, they take ages to flower. But the rhododendrons, they're a great feature. So I have to say that I learned a huge amount about rhododendrons. How about watering? Well, of course, they have this great canopy. So it's no good having an overhead watering system. And I worried a lot. Despite the fact that I'm not at Branklyn anymore, I would say to Alison, I hope Kate's coping with the watering up there. Because in the evenings, I would go out with a hose pipe and I would just stand with the hose pipe and soak the understory underneath these rhododendrons, because they're shallow rooted, but they've got to be kept soaked from time to time. And that was a huge advantage of living there. When you actually analyze the pathways and the steps and the walkways, this is so clever that Dorothy Renton would know which colors to position where. That's a huge skill. And you might say, well, she had plenty of time and she maybe did make some mistakes, but I don't think she did make many mistakes. You know, when Alice and I go out for a meal, I just go into the wardrobe and put my clothing on, and I think I've been pretty smart. And then she says, well, you're not going out like that. Why on earth would you combine such and such a tie with such? And I think, what's the big deal? But this is the thing. I think blokes are not always quite as good. I don't think I would be as clever when it comes to the positioning of colors. She was very, very gifted. Well, one thing's for sure, we would not have been able to manage the garden without a wonderful team. We had, as I mentioned, 50 volunteers, and the team, we regarded ourselves actually as a family. And I got bullied by the lady volunteers. They said, Jim, no, that's not going to work. That color's completely wrong. Don't you think it would be? And I thought, that's brilliant, having all this good advice. So we had a great team and an apprentice there, Jamie, from Scone. It was wonderful having these individuals. What are the main concerns when you've got a small garden with champion trees? Well, the largest hornbeam in Scotland is right beside the tea room and is lurking very close to the house. So we had to do remedial work on the hornbeam every single year. All the dead wood was removed. We had tree surgeons that came in from Crieff, and it took them about half an hour to get themselves rigged up. And then they would hoist themselves up to the top of the tree, and they would just be moving around like monkeys up at the top of the tree with 2 chainsaws and hand saws and removing the dead wood. Now, what was interesting, and why I want to labor this, is that we were standing underneath dealing with all this wood that was coming down. And some of the pieces of timber were as thick as my arm, dead pieces of wood. And when they crashed to the floor, and you lift them up, hornbeam is one of the hardest woods that there is. And you think, blimey, if one of these pieces of dead wood landed on a pram with a baby, we'd be in serious trouble. So health and safety for us was mainly the trees. We had to brace the hornbeam, which means that by having steel ropes holding the branches together, that if it does fall down, that the branches are swaying around, and it was designed so they wouldn't land on the house. or on people, of course. People are our main concern at Branklyn, but you know, when you have a gale, these named storms, you have to close. We close the botanics at 40 miles an hour, and the National Trust for Scotland do the same. The spring is simply sensational. Walking around the garden, Mrs. Renton had created wonderful spring flowers that were an absolute joy underneath all these rhododendrons. Lots of trilliums, white ones, red ones, yellow ones. Very, very special. And then the peonies. Peonies, if you plant a peony, you might be frustrated because you think they're here today, gone tomorrow. You have these amazing flowers, and then 3 or 4 days later, they've gone. And you think, what was all that about? You spend £125 on this peony Joseph rock there, which is right at the entrance of the garden, and the flowers are fleeting. But my goodness, they're beautiful. Which is why I don't take for granted the fact that Alice and I were living there for 6 years, and I could go out every single day of the week and throughout the year and take pictures, and my visitors would come in perhaps once, twice, 3 times a year, and it was potluck. Would the peony be in flower? Would this rhododendron, etc.? So we were very privileged. Unsurprisingly, I'm very interested in rock gardens because I'm an alpine man, and Mrs. Renton loved them too. And she had a good relationship with James Aitken, who had the nursery directly above Branklyn Garden at Orchard Bank. He was a great character. I met him in my early days when I was running Edram Nurseries. And when James Aitken was a laddie, he helped Mr. and Mrs. Renton create the rock garden. He was a master. And when I arrived, I trained in the Munich Botanic Garden with very special rock gardens. If one rock is out of place, that's the only rock that you'll see. As you're walking around the garden and you're passing through the rock garden, if there's one that's hopelessly wrong, it catches the eye. So it has to be right. And James Aitken got it right. And Mrs. Renton would have been standing there, no doubt, saying, no, a little bit to the right. Yes, that's good. Maybe turn that this way, that way. So an incredible rock garden with a wonderful array of alpine plants. Some very popular, some that you'll be very familiar with. Edelweiss when you're traveling and hiking in Switzerland or the Dolomites. But I wanted to point out this view here on the left. This was Dorothy Renton's favorite view from the library. I mean, just think about that. She designed that view, and her favorite tree was the Japanese maple on the right, the Acer. It's got a complicated name now, Acer shirsavanum aureum. And the position is just right. Each one of those trees and shrubs is spot on. That's a tremendous skill. I cannot overemphasize how clever Dorothy Renton was with her juxtapositions of trees, shrubs, etc. So some of the plants that feature on the rock garden, simply stunning. Gentians, the Adonis, people loved them when they came and took lots of pictures. The Paraquiligia, still growing in a trough. It was planted in 1949, still there today. So the role of a head gardener at a National Trust for Scotland property is to keep plants alive, unsurprisingly. So you've been left a property. So the Rentons had left Branklyn Garden to the National Trust for Scotland. So it was the role of head gardeners, subsequent head gardeners, to ensure that their legacy was retained. You don't just come in there and say, oh, I'm going to change all this and do this. You think about the legacy of the Rentons, which was very easy for me to do because everything was perfect. And these are some examples. Wonderful alpine plants. These were some of Dorothy Renton's favorite flowers. The shortia, the incaviglia. You'll be familiar with many of these plants. They're just so beautiful. And when you're walking around the rock garden, you can really home in on some of these very beautiful plants. For the centenary, in 2022, we decided that Mrs. Renton would probably be quite excited for us to create a contemporary, very small, just an area like this up here on the dais, a crevice garden. So I brought in a friend of mine who's the leading authority on crevice gardens from the Czech Republic, Jiří Papusek, and I brought a team in, and we constructed the crevice garden. It's now developed rather nicely. And apart from a rabbit coming into the garden last year and eating many of the plants, and I did say to Kate, you do need a Jack Russell Terrier in this place, but equally, my Pippa didn't particularly like the postman. So we did have to have the post box outside the garden, outside the fence. Some of the postmen like Jack Russells and they know how to deal with them, but Jack Russells can tell the postman that doesn't like Jack Russells and will nip the ankle. So yes, we did have a few issues with our Jack Russell. Wonderful flowers. The Primula scotica on the left-hand side is the only endemic wild flower in Scotland. It grows up on the north of around Caithness and on Orkney. And it also grows very well at Branklyn Garden. Just so many exciting plants, and it was great to have students coming in and enjoying these plants, but for many of our visitors, it was those who are very keen on photography that were able to capture many of these very beautiful flowers. At the entrance to the garden, I have to say, I thought, wow, Mrs. Renton was so clever to plant these azaleas, a great bed of azaleas at the entrance. And the scent coming off these azaleas, this lasted for many weeks. So you just approached, came in through the gate, and there was this amazing fragrance. She knew that, and that was so clever. And that's something that I think will be enjoyed by visitors for hundreds of years because they don't die. Then there are exciting trees. For example, the Betula albicinensis there was introduced by Joseph Rock, the seed from southwest China. Mrs. Renton raised it from seed, and now nearly 80 years on, you've still got this beautiful tree here with this papery bark, and the children love to tear that bark away, and in China, of course, it is paper. Magnolias are surely everyone's favorite, and there's this 100-year-old Magnolia wilsoni in the garden. It's just amazing. You pull down the branches and you get this wonderful fragrance of pineapple. Well worth visiting Branklyn at the end of May just to enjoy the magnolia. And there's Kate, who took over from me. She's doing a great job, and I'm delighted to see that she's happy there. One of the main features at Branklyn Garden are the Himalayan blue poppies. They're simply amazing. When I arrived, I realized that we need to really look after them well, so we lifted them, divided them, we create our own compost and leaf mold, we sterilize it to a temperature around 70 degrees Fahrenheit, so that we don't kill the beneficial bacteria, but that we kill weed seeds. There's no point in collecting all your own compost, having 3 years of compost bins, putting it all back on the garden full of weed seeds. Just creates more work. So the sterilizing was important. And every 3 years we would lift the sterile Mecanopsis, like the one that's called Dorothy Renton, which I hope you like, and divide it up. When I arrived, I spoke to someone who knew the Rentons. I didn't. And they said all the paths in the garden were grass in their time. And being a fanatical cricketer, I thought, wow, we need more grass here. I love the sound of a lawnmower, and the smell of cutting grass is one of my sad enjoyments. And so we created another grass path between her famous Mecanopsis there, and it's still there today and well looked after. So imagine all the paths being grass. Absolutely hopeless hopeless because we had hundreds of people coming in from Lochs and Glens tours, bus tours, and when it's slightly wet, they would absolutely wreck paths like that. So you've got to think of practicalities. But the Mecanopsis are simply stunning. They're not all blue. You see the white one, Marrett, there, but they are quite amazing. So yeah, you begin to see, you know, when the garden is really busy, we've got a Lochs and Glens tour here, and they're milling around the garden. They all come in. Caroline, one of the great volunteers at Branklyn, is here. She'd be in the tea room, and suddenly this great influx of people would come in, and yeah, it's very busy. But I think Dorothy Renton would have been delighted to see so many people enjoying her garden. And the blue poppies were her favorite, and to see all these blue poppies just at their best is something to behold. All different shades of blue. We've over 50 different types of blue poppy at Branklyn. I will continue saying we for I don't know how many years. I still think that I'm involved, but it's none of my business anymore. But every 3 years we would lift the clumps, divide them up, put them into, I have a source of fish boxes. We would put them into fish boxes with compost, grow them on, and the big, strong clumps would be replanted, and the little ones would be potted up for sale. So it's important to rejuvenate these plants every 3 years. Yeah, they're absolutely wonderful, and all I can say is they need to be well watered during the growing season. So I was fearful of how Kate was coping this year. But they are very, very splendid. All different colors. They're not all, as I said, all blue. We've got monocarpic red ones, monocarpic yellow ones. Monocarpic means that you raise them from seed. They take up to 2 years, and then to flower, and then they die. And you collect all the seed, and you can keep them going. Here's a problem. Mrs. Renton created her contours by using peat walls. She had a source of local peat from Montrose. The peat was cut into blocks and used as a wall. And she planted in between the peat blocks with ericaceous plants, plants that like peat. And they thrived. She had a collection of Cassiopes, plants like the ones we see here. These, oops, I'm racing on here. The Cassiopes here, and of course now the goal is to ban the use of peat in any garden. So it creates a problem for us in the Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh because we have peat walls there, and at Branklyn. For a while, Branklyn was the only garden that would be allowed to retain its peat walls. But these Cassiopes are all planted in a sod of peat. That's how they thrive. So there need to be a few exceptions. I remember when Michael Portillo was going around Scotland with his brightly coloured blazers and corduroy trousers, and he went into Glenmorangie distillery, and he caught the distillery manager on the hop a bit. He said, "Excuse me, sir, do you still use peat in the manufacture of your single malt whiskies?" And the poor chap wondered if, being an ex-politician, he was there to catch him out. He said, yes, the Scottish government have given the distilleries a dispensation for using peat to produce. He said, excellent. He said, I'm delighted to hear it. But as horticulturists, we're not allowed to use it. So that can cause issues. If you've got moisture, these primulas are indestructible. They're just so beautiful. And although this has been a drought year, originally, leading up to Kinnoul Hill, there were drains put in, and the water comes gushing down from Kinnoul Hill, if we do get rain, and it would filter through the garden, and we were able to grow these wonderful primulas so successfully. We can all grow these primulas in the garden if you've got moisture. There are special ones, like Primula viale. They're wonderful. And if you've got the right conditions, you can grow these very rare orchids. These are lady slipper orchids. The one on the left, Reginae, is from North America, from Michigan, and Tibeticum is unsurprisingly from China and Tibet, and very beautiful. These are all thriving at Branklyn. The arisamas, so beautiful. You need to search out for them. Have a chat with the head gardener and say, whereabouts are the arisamas growing? And they'll take you to where they're flowering. The members of the ginger family are amazing too, these roscoias. We loved them, and they flower for a long period of time later in the season. These are seriously expensive plants, so you pay about £25 for a Nemochoris bulb on the left. The Paris japonica could be over £50, but once you've got it in the garden, it won't die. They're good value, many of these plants. You just need to trust your bank account. And we created an arch, which is now well established, with a white wisteria, again for the centenary, and the original sundial running right through here. This was an original design from Dorothy Renton. Not the wisteria, I hasten to add. She would probably have thought, I'm not sure that it's fully hardy here in Perthshire, but with climate change, we can do these wisterias, no bother. I think the most important thing is the future, and we had a good relationship with Kinnoul Primary School, and the children up to the primary 7 would come up to the garden, and they loved their time in the garden. What were they most interested in? Well, having a game on the grass, going down to the pond to look for tadpoles, and maybe the mallard would be there. And then we had an area for carnivorous plants, for sundews, and we managed to keep the Venus flytrap going, sitting in, I suppose I'm not allowed to say this word, but sphagnum moss, which is the origin of peat. And so the children loved that. And so really, it's so important to capture the interest for young people. Otherwise, we're not going to have a future. I really do despair when I see how difficult it is to get young people interested in the garden. And that's my granddaughter, the wee rascal, who lives in Barcelona. She would, the family would come up from Edinburgh, having flown in, and rather than saying hello to their granny and grandpa, they would just go straight down to the waterfall and the pond, because we had rubber frogs, ready for them to play with. And for 2022, we had obviously some special evenings with drinks to celebrate the centenary, and the late Jim McCall from the Beech Grove Garden came down, and of course with Brian Cunningham, who's head gardener at Scone. He's also on the, as you know, on the Beech Grove Garden. It was nice to see the two of them happy together there. We have some very famous lilies, which were created by the late Dr. Christopher North in Invergary, and the breeding station there. These are very special. And Madeline Tinson, as many of you know, she has a national collection of these lilies in Perth, in her glass house and garden. But these lilies are so special, they extend the season. They're so valuable. Lilies, the giant lily from Yunnan, and then Lilium regale. You need to be careful if you go too close to it and you rub against it and you get the orange pollen all over your clothes, which I frequently did and got into trouble for. But no, the lilies are stunning. Some of these have been at Branklyn for decades. The one on the right, Lilium monodelphum, absolutely superb. Lilium superbum was planted in the 1920s, grows up to about 8 feet in height, and it's towering. There are 2 areas where it's planted at Branklyn, and it's surviving so well. When you've got clumps of lily bulbs, you do not go in with a tatty fork and dig them up and split them up. They hate it. If you have to do it, sometimes it'll work, but you've got to be so careful with dividing lilies. They set masses of seed. You just need to be patient. They only take 6 years to flower from seed, so I'm sure we're all patient gardeners. I was always concerned with my team that we wanted to have an extension of colour through the season. I didn't want people to come and say, oh, yeah, this is very much a spring garden. You've got lots of exciting plants flowering in the spring. You've got the rhododendrons, then the Meconopsis in May, June, etc. So we were very keen to plant more herbaceous plants that give you colour. As I'm sure you're aware, we've got herbaceous plants now flowering profusely today in our gardens. The dahlias in East Lothian haven't been frosted yet. So we would try and extend the season for this colour. And then the autumn kicks in, and we've got the very famous Kiringashoma from Japan, the lovely colchicums, more roscoias with so much late colour, which is useful. And right in front of the house, Mrs. Renton planted some Hydrangea paniculata grandiflora with a lily. And I thought, that's so clever. And that's still there today, planted in the 1920s, and it's still there today, which I think is what is so important for us as head gardeners of properties is to maintain the original legacy wherever possible of the owners. As we come to the close of the season, the autumn colour is stunning. This year it's been particularly good. In some cases, some of the maples the leaves turned brown and fell very quickly because they were so dry. But some of them were exceptionally good. This is obviously a picture I took in my time there. I'm sure that there's great colour. I was in the garden last weekend, and there was still some great colour. People would say, we've read about the fact that you've got this Katsura tree at Branklyn, and then when you walk under the tree, it smells of burnt sugar. And I was thinking, oh, I hope to goodness it's working today. You know, it's a bit like the electric bray in Ayrshire. You hope when you tell people to see if that it will work. Well, this is amazing. And when Alice and I were in last weekend, it still had the smell of burnt sugar, and yet all the leaves had fallen. So that's well worth seeing in the autumn, as are these amazing dianthus. I mean, the autumn colour, Mrs. Renton knew exactly what would really make a real show in the autumn. She had planted autumn gentians at Branklyn, and they had died subsequently. I would think 1976 was probably a killer. It was a terribly dry year in 1976. I was working in Aviemore, and the gentians died. So I was keen with my team to replant the gentians. But they like a product that begins with P and ends with T. So I had a few problems. They love peat, and they like to be kept really well watered during the growing season. So if you like these autumn gentians, that's what they like. But they're a wonderful show. And again, looking at the famous red book, we were able to identify what Mrs. Renton had originally planted. So yes, I mean, the autumn colour, amazing. And these final gentians, they're still in flower today, actually. And of course, the garden closes in a week or so's time, the end of October. So this is the view that you might get as you're coming towards the end of the season. I found it terribly difficult to say goodbye to our volunteers at the end of the season. At the end of October into November, we had a party for all the volunteers. And then Alice and I would have to say goodbye to them until the beginning of April. I mean, many of them, of course, we would see in the interim period. But, you know, we had this amazing relationship with as a family almost. And they loved coming in for maybe 1 or 2 days in the week. So the autumn was, it's a sad time in a way, because we were saying goodbye to our visitors and our team. And it's the end of the season, as it were. But looking at that picture, please think about John and Dorothy Renton, because that's what they created. I had nothing to do, none of the head gardeners have had anything to do with that. That was what, she had that vision. I think it's remarkable to have that sort of vision. And Alison and I loved our stay there. You know, we were able to go along to the woods beyond Scone and collect chanterelles, a favourite in the evening with a glass of white wine. And there's the naughty, sorry, Alison's nice, but the naughty Jack Russell there. We had a wonderful time, so thanks very much.
Time for a few questions, and Dawn is going to go around. In the absence of Dave, Dawn is going to man the roving microphone. There we go.
I think that's a very good question. John Renton was in real estate, and he built houses, and he was always looking for a spot where you got a view. So really, some of the properties, as you might be familiar with, along underneath Kinnoull Hill, are very much sought after. With some rather well-to-do people live in that area, and it's all about the view. So they came and they saw all this awful scrub, just fruit trees and scrub on a steep slope. And they had this vision that if they contoured and created terraces weaving around in the garden, it would work, because they were looking southwest towards Crieff, and it was a great position from that point of view. They had a tennis court early on, and they created the garden, and then where the rock garden is today was a single tennis court. And so initially things were very different, and then when Dorothy received these very exciting seeds coming in from the Himalaya, then the garden developed in a slightly different way. But initially it was I would never think about it. What a work, creating a garden on a steep 45-degree slope. But they had that vision, and they had prisoners.
Okay, any more questions? Dave, oh.
On? Yes, we're on. You said about the snowdrops and the fact that mid-February is the time, and yet the garden is closed until April. And I'm just wondering why.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the obvious question. We opened the garden for a week. It's open now for a full week. Initially, it was just a weekend for us, and we felt that having a snowdrop weekend would allow people to just walk around and enjoy the winter garden. But your question would probably be, if you're opening for snowdrops, why not open much earlier anyway? And I suppose the National Trust for Scotland had the idea that we needed to get a lot of work done, particularly the remedial work with the trees during the closed season, and we needed to make sure that everything was shipshape for reopening on April the 1st. Yes, if it was my choice, I would have had it more, rather like Brian Cunningham has at Scone. I would have had a longer period of open time for the snowdrops and for the winter season. But at least it meant that people could come into the garden in February to see the spring colour. But I take your point.
Thank you.
About flowers. Okay. A couple of weeks ago at a meeting, I was talking to a friend, and our conversation, not unusually, turned to acorns. Now, we both agreed that this autumn we'd never seen so many acorns ever.
Yeah.
And we'd like your opinion on why we've seen so many acorns this year.
Well, I'm very fascinated by that question, because I've never seen so many acorns. Where we live in Haddington, our oak trees produced a huge amount of acorns. acorns obviously come as a result of flowering, and it was an exceptional year for flowering. And such has been the quantity of acorns that I was in Holland last week and near Utrecht, and they have wild boar in the woods in that area, and they're just mopping up all the acorns. But they're also doing a lot of damage in the process because they wreck the road verges. They come out at night and so on. But in Holland, they were saying it was a record harvest of acorns, and they were glad to have the wild boar. They also have wolves that eat the piglets. So it's the ecology works. But I think it's all to do with flowering. It's an exceptional year for many trees for flowering. I think it's going to be a major problem for people who have ash trees, for example, which we had when I had the nursery. The seed is a pain in the neck. Acorns are a pain in the neck. If 2 acorns fall in a nursery pot, they very quickly germinate, and the roots will go around, and you've got a major problem. So it's to do with the flowering season. Exceptional year for flowering.
Thank you, Jim, for a very interesting presentation. I love visiting the Branklyn Gardens, not just for the flowers, but also for the tea room, I have to say. But I am not a gardener, and therefore my daft lassie question is, why are you not allowed to use peat any longer?
Right. Well, the simple reason is the carbon emissions. When peat is harvested, there's a considerable emission of carbon, and obviously everyone in the world is endeavoring to keep the carbon emissions down. You might say that aeroplanes produce far more carbon emissions than peat. The thing is that the horticultural industry doesn't actually use that much peat. And if Ken Cox and I were up here and debating the subject of peat, we both recognize that we need to be careful not to use too much peat, but that there are certain plants, like ericaceous plants, rhododendrons, etc., which need it, and whiskey. So if the whiskey industry is important to the Scottish government, then I think the horticultural industry should have a dispensation, but only where necessary. You would never buy peat and start using it as a mulch in the garden. It simply encourages moss. But when you're incorporating it into the soil for plants that have this requirement for an ericaceous mix, it's important. But it's simply because of the carbon emissions, to answer your question.
Any more?
It was partly instinctive, but she had always loved traveling to the mountains, and I think I have to say myself, I wasn't always into alpines, but I went to work in Munich and went into the mountains, and I just suddenly had this great passion for alpine plants. And that was her main joy, was having a rock garden, but she loved all plants, like we all do. But that was the reason. And many people say, why did they call it Branklyn? And their favorite holiday destinations were Branksome Towers in Dorset, and they would go down to Linwood in Cornwall. And so they created a portmanteau to produce the 2 words Branklyn. I have so many people, I didn't know that until relatively recently. People come in and I would, you don't want to be caught out completely, so you make up some nonsense. You say, this is some sort of American name, I'm sure. But I'm so glad to know the truth now as to how they came up with it. But she loved traveling, and that's, I think, what engendered her love of wildflowers. No scientific knowledge, she wasn't trained. Her husband made the money and she spent it.
Okay. Well, just remains for me to say thank you very much, Jim, for a absolutely fascinating, informative, wide-ranging talk about the garden and about, again, a very wide range of plants, all delivered with enthusiasm, infectious enthusiasm, I think is what we'd say with that. And also covering the amazing vision and skill of the Rentons all those years ago, and also keeping the records, which is not always the case. So it's been absolutely brilliant talk. Thank you very much. We've got a great audience, and it's gone down very well. So we'll just say thanks again, give you a good usual applause. Thanks, everybody. Well, that wraps it up for today. Just to mention that the next open meeting is on the 24th of November, and we're going to hear about a trip to Everest Base Camp. So we look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks.